Radoslav Albrecht. I'm the founder and CEO of Bitbond. Bitbond is the first global marketplace lending platform for small business loans. From day one, since we got started in 2013, we use cryptocurrencies for payment processing. And right now we're in the middle of preparing an ICO, and we are launching one of the first security tokens in Europe. And today I want to share some of my experiences that we have gained so far in the preparation and what it means to run a security ICO. So first of all, ICOs, probably everyone in this room has already spent a considerable amount of time with looking at them. They're a fairly popular way of fundraising, even though the hype is a little bit over, which was at the end of 2017, early 2018. Still in July 2018, there was over $600 million raised through ICOs. And actually the average raised per ICO is still around 10 million, so that's still a considerable sum of money. If you compare that to VC funding, for example, if you go out, have a startup and you want to get a seed round or an A round, then if you raise this much from VCs, that's quite a lot. And if you manage to do that through an ICO, this may have a couple of advantages, and that is why so many people still, even though the main hype may be over, or at least maybe paused, are looking into ICOs. Simply a way of fundraising. Now, when you do an ICO, you can launch it in many different ways. If you look at it in a bit of a simplified way, then there are mainly two ways how to do an ICO. And one is you run a utility token or you run a security token. When you run a utility token, then the token typically represents some kind of payment method on your platform that you created. So this could be like loyalty points, for example. Probably all of us know loyalty point programs of airlines like Miles & More or others, where you collect miles, you collect air miles, and you can spend these air miles on an online shop, for example. And these utility tokens have a very similar function, so they serve as a payment method on certain online platforms. When you run an ICO where you sell utility tokens, then you are effectively receiving revenue, which means that you are selling a product or a service that you are going to deliver at some point in the future, unless your platform is already live, and you're receiving part of the revenue for it already today, which means that you have to pay taxes on that, which has a relatively far-reaching implication and is kind of a disadvantage of running a utility token ICO. At the same time, running a utility token ICO also can have an advantage because in most cases these are unregulated instruments. If you want to generalize, then you can say you don't need to comply with any kind of regulatory requirements if it's a real pure utility token, and that means that the whole legal side is less complicated and potentially also less expensive. For the investors, this also has implications because when they buy your utility token, they don't have any kind of investor protection rights because typically they don't receive an equity share in your company, but they believe that this product that you're planning to launch will at some point exist and that they can pay for that with their utility token. So these are all kind of the advantages and disadvantages. And then in contrast to that, we've got security tokens. And with security tokens, a lot of things are actually very similar to the conventional world of fundraising that we already know. Typically, the capital that you raise through security tokens is either equity or debt. If it's equity, then it's a certain kind of share that you give out in your company. If it's debt, then you need to repay it at some point. And the instruments are relatively conventional. Debt and equity financing is obviously something that's not exactly new. For the investors, this also means that they have certain rights under which they are protected, both either as an equity or as a debt investor. And this, at the same time, means that there are specific legal requirements and regulatory requirements around security tokens. And this is something that I want to dive more into in my presentation today. If you look at conventional securities, And you compare that to a security token. This is probably the most important comparison to be made, because if you have decided that you want to raise equity or debt through an ICO, then it's relatively clear that you will need a security token. And now the question is, why would someone run a security token ICO instead of doing a normal IPO, an initial public offering at a regulated exchange or a bond issue? Why would someone decide to do that via a token? And the reason for that can be multiple. First of all, when you run an IPO, for example, you would typically need investment banks running the IPO for you to help you with finding investors, typically institutional investors, and this is relatively expensive. There aren't many good ways to run an IPO without an investment bank, and this automatically means that the cost of an IPO is relatively high. While with a security token ICO, you can most of the time just run the ICO yourself. Of course, you can work with a bank if you want, but you're not required to do that, because you could make the distribution online with online marketing tools yourself, like many ICOs have done before and have shown that it works. One other important part is that you also need someone to process your payments, right? Typically, the money from the investors for a conventional security arrives in a bank account, while if you use a blockchain platform to run your ICO, typically blockchains obviously with their native currencies have a payment method directly included in that technology. So when you run it on top of Ethereum, your investors can pay with Ether. When you run it on top of Stellar, they can pay with Stellar Lumens and all the other platforms that are out there. And another advantage is you don't need a central clearinghouse. Some of you may have heard the company Clearstream. Clearstream is a central clearinghouse, and it's kind of a monopolist, at least in Europe, where if you issue a security, then Clearstream will typically do the central clearing. When you do an ICO, you don't need that, because the clearinghouse is kind of taken over by the blockchain. So the proof of ownership in a token is done via the blockchain in a decentralized way, and you don't need a big monopolist like Clearstream. One other important point is the liquidity. When you run an IPO or when you do a bond issue, then you will, of course, want to have a secondary market for that. And in order for that to happen, you will need to have an agreement with an exchange that is going to list your security. While with ICOs, one of the big advantages is, of course, that you can list the tokens on decentralized exchanges. Of course, you also would like to be listed on a bigger exchange like Kraken or Bitstamp or Binance or some of the other big exchanges. However, it doesn't have to be that way, because most of the bigger ICO platforms like Ethereum, like Stellar, have decentralized exchanges which are way more permissionless than centralized exchanges. So these are some of the reasons why it may actually be worth running a security token ICO versus issuing a conventional security with all the costs that are associated with it. Now, when you do run a security issue, you need a prospectus. And the fact that you need a prospectus when you issue a security is the reason why many security ICOs so far have decided actually not to run, because the prospectus comes with a couple of hurdles. First of all, you need to disclose a lot of information, and you're actually liable for the information that you're disclosing there. So you cannot just come up with a nice story and say, yeah, this is what I'm planning. You will actually be held liable for what is being said in the prospectus, which means you typically describe your business activity, you describe the investment risks, and the risk part is typically the biggest and most comprehensive part of a prospectus. You will also state why, what you need the proceeds and how you will spend the proceeds from the security issue, and you will also state what are the rights of the investors. And so these are all things that are very, very clear, because the way a prospectus is structured is typically determined by law. So you don't have a lot of room for changing the content and changing the structure of the prospectus. There are also no fancy pictures or presentations. This is normally a document which purely consists of text. Now, the prospectus is something that's relatively expensive, because in most cases you won't have the experience yourself to write the prospectus, but you will want to work with a law firm that has done many prospectuses before. And so this is why, for many, it seems like running a security token ICO has a big hurdle, and the prospectus is the main part of that. The prospectus will also determine in which jurisdictions you can distribute your security. While utility tokens typically are borderless, there may be a few countries like China that say they ban any kind of ICO, but other than that, utility tokens can normally be distributed all across the world. While when you do a security token with the prospectus, you will normally determine where you can do the distribution and from where you can have investors. So in a certain degree, it will limit yourself in the fundraising process. Now, as the second part of the presentation, I want to show you the way we are planning the security token issue at Bitbond and the experiences that I've made so far. We have not yet launched it. We're in the middle of the process, but what we've learned so far I want to share with you now. So first of all, what is Bitbond actually? Bitbond is a SME lending platform. We provide working capital loans to small business owners. In many cases, these are online shops like eBay sellers, Amazon sellers, Etsy sellers, and they need to finance the inventory, and when they want to do that, in many cases they come to us where they can get loans of up to 50,000 euros or dollars. We run all the payments via cryptocurrencies. We use Stellar and Bitcoin for that. And the reason why we use cryptocurrencies for payment processing is simply that international payment transactions are cheaper and faster through cryptocurrencies than if we use conventional methods like the SWIFT system, which is typically the interbank settlement system for interbank payments. So we are saving quite a bit of money on the transactions, and at the same time we can have users from all across the world. We're not just limited to one or two markets, but we have users from many different countries. We've actually funded borrowers from over 80 countries, and so far we funded loans worth of $13 million. And now the ICO that we are planning, we are doing for the reason that we want to diversify the debt investors that we have on our platform. Also, right now, if you want to invest through Bitbond, you need to have some kind of experience in managing your own loan portfolio. The loans are relatively small, and as an investor, you will also want to have a diversified portfolio, ideally with more than 100 loans, in order to take advantage of diversification. Now, if you don't want to do that, you can buy our security token, because the proceeds of the token issue will be used in order to fund loans, and we will manage the portfolio. So the token is very similar to buying a fund. And from a legal perspective, the token is actually a bond. So this is not an equity instrument. You're not receiving shares in Bitbond as a company, but you are providing debt to Bitbond that will then be invested through into loans on our platform. We are paying annual interest of 4%. When we paid it out quarterly, so each quarter in a year we'll pay out 1% interest on the investment amount that you put in. Plus, you will get 60% of the profits of those investments. So since we are investing in small business loans here, the expected return on a portfolio is around about 10%. So that when this entity that is doing the investment is making a profit, 60% of that will be shared with the token investors. The maturity of the product is 10 years. So when you invest into that, after 10 years, you'll get your initial principal back, plus, of course, the interest that has been paid out throughout the lifetime of that product. Now, when we decided to run this, it was relatively clear that this is a security, right? And it was also relatively clear that this is a bond. We're not giving any equity rights to any investor, but we're giving a product that is a interest rate-based payout. And so we knew we needed a prospectus for that. We got in touch with our law firm, with whom we already worked together since 5 years. Bitbond was launched in 2013, and we actually have our own BaFin license, so we are a regulated financial institution. And so we were trying to figure out how we can run this. And so yeah, it turns out it's a bond, and we started to work on a prospectus. There are a couple of complications that came in, because of course there have been many bond issues in Germany, like in the thousands, but you cannot just copy and paste that, because there are a few things that are different when you run it as an ICO instead of doing a conventional security. And actually this fact that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, that you don't need Clearstream or another central clearinghouse, is actually a pretty big difference from a legal perspective, because normally at least according to European law, each security exists on a piece of paper. And Clearstream virtually is managing all the paper from all the securities that have been issued. And now we needed to find a way to communicate through the prospectus to the potential investors and to the regulator how actually the proof of ownership of our tokens happens through the blockchain. So we found a way to do that, but this was actually one challenge that we needed to go through. Then other challenges that we needed to solve was we do the interest payout in Stellar lumens because we are running this ICO on the Stellar blockchain where we tokenize this bond. And now, since we are not only receiving money from investors, but we are also paying something back in the form of interest, we needed to have a way to make those payments. And since these are Stellar tokens that the investors will be holding in Stellar wallets, the good thing is that we know their Stellar addresses. And we can pay out the interest payments through Stellar lumens to the wallets of our investors. But this is also something that needed a relatively comprehensive description in the prospectus, and this is also, of course, something that is new for the regulator. And this is a part that we've already discussed with the regulator in great depth, because they needed to understand how this works, because obviously this is something they have not seen before. So these are kind of the main challenges that we ran into. And so as a conclusion, when you make the decision to run a security token ICO, there are a couple of things that, even though we have not yet fully ran it because we're right now waiting for the approval of the prospectus by the regulator, there are a few things that we already learned. First of all, a prospectus comes with relatively high legal fees. And what I personally would advise you to do is to find a law firm that you trust, that have done many security issues before, and that work together with you on a fixed price basis. Because typically lawyers tend to price their services on a per day or even per hour basis, which can get really, really expensive. And we have agreed on a fixed price with them, which has proven to be very favorable for us, to be honest, because it turned out that the prospectus was a lot of more work than we actually anticipated. Then also it takes a long time to write the prospectus, and it's almost impossible to underestimate this. When our lawyer said, yeah, this is a security prospectus, this is something that we'll have easily done in 6 weeks because we've done many other security prospectuses before, then this is something that is simply an underestimation of the time it takes. We have been working on this for over 6 months now, and the reason for that is what I just tried to elaborate on, is that although it is a security issue, many things are different, like the clearing, like the payments, and these things need to be described in the prospectus in a way that the investors are going to understand it and that the regulator knows what's going on. The third learning is also a positive one, because so far I've been mainly talking about challenges and what kind of hurdles came into the way. And there's also a really positive aspect, and that's the added trust that you can have when you have a very well-written prospectus. Because as we all know, some of the ICOs that have ran over the past 12 to 18 months have not been, let's say, the most legit kind of projects. And when you do the work of creating a prospectus that everyone knows costs a lot of time and money, then it can create a bit more trust for your project. And this may be something that can be helpful in fundraising. So these are the main learnings that I can share with you so far, and now I'm happy to take the questions that you may have.